Right. Adrian, what's your view on the current state of masculinity?
I think the word for me right now that defines masculinity today is polarized, probably, which I know is a bit of a cliche when we talk about the world and polarization. But I think it is. And I think basically men are split into two camps. One is kind of the powerful, selfish men that became resented somehow because they feel threatened by women essentially and by change as a whole. So obviously think Donald Trump, but also millions of silent everyday Joes, right? And it's essentially, I mean, I think it's very easy to understand why they are that way. Basically, because it's very tough to give up power, right? You've been kind of groomed this way in a world where, whatever, men didn't have to cook, men didn't have to clean, men didn't have to do all the horrible shit that the women had to deal with. And suddenly, hey, you actually have to give up some of your power and get off the couch and do shit. So those are, I would say, kind of this first group of men. And then there is the guys who believe in inequality and understand that it's the world, culture, society has been unfair to women for a very long time, and actually men and women should share the same kind of capabilities, responsibilities, power positions, and everything, and they should probably split 50-50 all the kind of all the good and all the bad things that need to happen in the world. So those are kind of the two camps, and I think hopefully the kind of the second camp, the most kind of equality minded men, is going to be growing, whereas the kind of these powerful resented men are going to be kind of decreasing and going away.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see that as well. I mean, I've seen people describe the US election as a little bit of the masculinity election. Like, what type of masculine attributes are you voting for? Are you voting for the Trump, JD Vance, strangely dystopian kind of characters? Or are you voting for like the more thoughtful Tim Waltz, etc. kind of characters who wants to coach little league and just generally be like a really good person to be in barbecues with and whatever. So yeah, I definitely see that it's obviously it's very present in our minds, the U.S. election, but generally speaking, it feels quite indicative to what masculinity is what discussion of our masculinity is. One of the things I'm curious is, like, obviously it's very easy for us to talk about the negative attributes of masculinity, which we'll get there in a second, but what do you think are positive attributes worth preserving in men?
I think we are learning the art of empathy, which I think is not naturally something that is a kind of a male trait, or I don't think we've been brought up as empathetic human beings per se. And there is this story about world famous creative guy, advertising guy called Bill Bernbach from the B in DDB. And he used to walk around at the agency with a piece of paper in his pocket that read, "He might be right." And every time he was in a meeting with somebody or chatting with somebody else, he would pull his piece of paper and read, "He might be right," just as an acknowledgement of the fact that actually you may not always have a position of power, or you may not always be right in your own way of thinking. And I'm thinking that probably we should update that piece of paper that Bill Bernbach had and add an S at the beginning, right? And say she might be right. Every time we talk to women, both in a professional and a personal level. I think that's just thinking of the possibility of the other person, in this case, particularly women, being right. And even if they have a point of view that differs from our own, I think that it's really helpful. I think that's really cool.
That is interesting. I mean, it definitely feels linked to certainly what my LinkedIn feed has been kind of, but between the Tesco ads and the Burger King ads and whatever, but much more serious topics like women talking about abuse and women talking about just being harassed and being, and for lack of a better term, just annoyed the shit out of by just really shitty male behavior. I don't know, like I feel like a lot of times it's easy for men to go, well, maybe you didn't mean it that way, but you go, yeah, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what the person felt. I have that conversation with Raquel, my partner, sometimes where we'll have an argument and we both have said this to each other and we're both right when we say it, even though it's very annoying when the other person says it. which is, I know that wasn't your intention, but what matters is how I felt. And I'm a believer in that. And she's a believer in that. And so if I say something that feels demeaning and that's not what I meant, sure, that's not what I meant. That's okay. But what she felt is as real as what was intended, right? At least from my perspective. And so even if someone wasn't necessarily a creep, but someone felt creeped out, believe them, you know? Like that's as valid. And so yeah, there's definitely that degree of like empathy. And it is uncomfortable, right? Because sometimes you might disagree, like you say, but I don't know, like I feel like sometimes men want to have an honest conversation, then they come off as being defensive by disagreeing. When I would argue, like, even if you disagree, that's not the place to disagree because that person is under emotional distress. What's your
Yeah.
thoughts on that? Like, if you disagree with someone, should you say it and try and have that argument, that conversation with them, or is it not the time and just let them express themselves?
I tend to avoid confrontation. That's my kind of personality. And my psychologist talked about it in length. We could invite him over.
And you never disagree with them.
No, I just don't enjoy confrontation. It's not my thing. I think it's a good thing every time I disagree with my significant other, with Sarah or whoever maybe. I think it's good to postpone the conversation to a moment where you are more relaxed, or to a different context, or to a different setting. Or maybe it's Friday evening when you are having a glass of wine, and it's easier to talk about certain things other than on a Tuesday afternoon when you're rushing and you're taking the kids somewhere. And I think the context definitely defines the quality of the conversation that you can have with somebody, the exchange, human exchange. And so that's kind of my tactic in that respect. I think acknowledging the fact that you may be wrong, for men, that's already a massive first step, because I think we are brought up in a way where it's more important that we are right than the fact that we are doing the correct thing, the right thing,
Yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think that happens? Like, is it just because that's how our dads were brought up and therefore that's what the culture imparted into us? Or like, what do you think's going on there?
I think so. I think so. There is this. I think that's part of toxic masculinity. I think the obsession with winning. I think that's something that is there lying somewhere, and the fact that life is a zero-sum game where if I am right, that means that you are wrong. Whereas I think it's much more interesting if you think I may be right and you too, and I may have my points, and I may be right in some aspects of the question that we are debating, and you may be right somehow differently. And both ways of thinking can actually make sense in a weird way, even if we have disagreements over a specific point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where, well, two things come to mind. One is a quote that I think I saw from, well, I think I wrote it down because it might have been on a podcast from, oh God, what's her name? The woman who did the fitness cassettes, and Jane Fonda.
Yeah, from that. Yeah.
Actually, a much better reference is she features in Grace and Frankie, which is a phenomenal show. And she's just a generally badass woman. But I remember in the context of a conversation, she talked about how nothing is true all the time. And I quite like that. I like that if you take that approach of nothing is true all the time, there is no absolutism to I'm right, you're wrong. It's like I might be right in a context and wrong in another. Which goes back to that point of like, in the heat of an argument, I might be right, but I'm not helping. If I'm like poking, I do that. That's one of my character flaws is I go, no, 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 but, and then I just keep twisting the wound in order to be right. And over the years, I started learning that like when the person says, let's talk about this later, I just need to swallow it up and go, okay. And then not come back 2 minutes later and go, but actually, like that's the hard bit. It's like your ego hates
That's
that.
interesting. And I think there is another key difference, and I think this is probably from a biology standpoint between men and women, is that men, we are qualified to find solutions. Women are qualified to discuss things. They don't necessarily need to fix problems. They just need to talk about problems
Yeah.
somehow. And it happens to me all the time with
Yeah.
with Sarah. And it's like, yeah, but why don't we do that? And then I realize, it took me a while to realize this, but sometimes she just wants to discuss things. She doesn't
Yeah.
want to fix the world. She just wants to talk about problems that she's having, how she's feeling about that, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Whereas I rush to, we could do this and that, and then I'll take the car and I'll do. which is a very kind of, I think, Neanderthal way of, we're leaving the cave and we are fucking chasing dinosaurs in the
Yeah,
prairie.
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I relate to that. I mean, I always wonder, I'm not an expert in this, and I don't know if this makes the final cut, but just as a reflection, I never know if it's like biology or sociology or maybe a mix of the two. I don't know if it's like something in the chemical compositions that we have that are the genetic predispositions that we have. But I definitely noticed that. Like one of the big revelations for me with Raquel, whenever she's talking about something tough, is, and I don't always do it, but I think I'm better at remembering to do it, is she says, it's good to ask, do you want to talk about it, or do you want advice?
Oh
And
yeah.
that's what you're saying. It's like we're so quick on going, oh, but of course, what you need to do. Like, I'll give you an example. Emma, our daughter, is going to nursery. She's going through the adaptation period, and she's doing very well. But we know how it is with kids, and like she spent 2 years at home. It's hard to kind of be away from mommy for a while, etc. And Raquel has been kind of looking after the adaptation period while I'm working, etc. She goes and she spends a few hours in the nursery while Emma's there. And the other day she messaged me and she went like, I'm psychologically like destroyed after today because not only was it hard to see Emma kind of sometimes, calling for me and whatever, see this degree of empathy there, but it's the other kids that also ask for their mommies. And she goes like, oh, could you want a hug? And the kids get a hug. And then they go, oh, but I still miss my mommy. And like stuff like that really just put her down, like psychologically for the day, because it's tough. Now, in that situation, I could just go, don't worry, they're not your children. It's not your problem to solve. It's probably correct, but it's not the right point. It's not the right moment to have. And it's just go, oh, I get it. Like, I probably feel the same way. And we talk a bit about it and then we move on. She didn't need a solution. She just needed to be seen,
That's
right?
it.
And that for me took a fucking long time to acknowledge that. Like sometimes you just want to be seen. You just want someone to go, yeah, that is tough. Fuck, sorry, and then move on. Are there any other positive attributes that you notice in men that you think are worth
I
highlighting?
think there's a question with time and effort, and the fact that we have realized, or we are realizing that actually it takes time to do the right thing, or do things
Yeah.
right, and equality, it does require, putting some time in and kind of giving up on some kind of space that used to belong to you, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
own space. So we were talking about doing the dishes after dinner. It is a pain. It is a pain in the ass, but it is a pain in the ass equally for your wife, right? So all those kind of things. I think we like. I can remember my dad clearly never getting up from lunch to just to take dishes back to the kitchen, which is, to me, it's unthinkable
Yeah.
now. But it's probably, if we were living 100 years back, I think it would be very comfortable, for us life back then, because we weren't even supposed to. Nobody would question us if. But I think investing time and effort, I think that's a good thing that we have learned over the last, I would say, probably 30 years, 40 years, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a not to make this too much about house chores, but I remember someone telling me, don't remember the context, maybe it was on an email or something, but a man said, for me, the definition of love in a marriage, it's noticing things and addressing them. And what he meant is like, don't expect the other person to just, oh, it's not my job to clean this counter, or it's not my job to, pick up this laundry. Like, if you notice it and you have time to go, oh yeah, I'm just going to fix this. Like for example, today I came to our little home office and the floor was quite dirty, so I was just like, I'm just going to vacuum this. It's like 40 seconds, just and then get it away. And stuff like that, I'm trying to get better at, just like noticing things, addressing them, and that being an expression of love and respect. It's like, I'm not expecting you to fix this. I'll just kind of pick it up and do it. Now, obviously, that probably makes things a bit tougher because you need to be more communicative. Like, it's not like there's a hierarchy. It's like your job is to do the dishes, and therefore we don't need to talk about the dishes. It's known. It is known. Whereas in this scenario, you need to be more open talking about stuff and not just having pre-assigned roles. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
not like when I get home, Raquel goes, right, just as a reminder, you are now in charge. It's like, I just know, but because we talked so much about it. But yeah, it's interesting. Like those, it's like you always need to be, I don't want to say negotiating in the sense that you're trying to get a better deal for yourself. You're always negotiating roles, I find, in this modern version of masculinity. You're not just expecting, oh, of course you do the dishes. Oh, of course you do the laundry. It's like, no, we're negotiating what each of us feel a bit more okay doing, and making sure that the share is even, you know? But it's
Yeah.
harder. It's just harder. It means you need to speak more about stuff.
I agree. There is I remember a few years back in Cannes Lions, the founders of 72 and Sunny, they gave a chat about, creating an agency and creating an agency culture and having teams, da, da, da. I remember vividly when they said they had a poster printed on the wall that said, always assume best intentions, which I think is great because it kind of helps you frame whatever disagreement or tough situation that you may be going through with somebody that you coexist with, be it your couple or your colleagues or your associates or whatever it may be. And the fact that you naturally assume that kind of the goodwill on the other end of the conversation, I think that is a great kind of way of approaching things and avoiding unnecessary drama.
Yeah. It feels related to the he, she, they may be right, in the sense that I think it's healthy. So I need to unpack what I'm going to say. I think it's healthy to assume that very few people wake up and think, do you know what? I'm going to be an evil little shit today.
Yeah, exactly.
However, there's a lot of people that don't even know they're being evil little shits because they don't have enough emotional availability to their own. They don't have enough self-awareness, whatever. And all of those are problems. But yeah, even in popular culture, the best villains always have a valid enough reason for what they're doing, and the reason might be I was rejected. Doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. So I'm actually, let me go into like popular culture, because obviously you and I talk about this through the lens of fatherhood, but like, who do you think represents proper positive masculinity today in popular culture?
Well, we discussed in Papa Palooza, we talked about Michael Keaton, the actor,
Mhm.
and the fact that he gave up on so many amazing roles because he wanted to be close to his kid as he was growing up. And I think it's actually that's interesting because I think part of kind of modern masculinity is about kind of sacrificing time and effort devoted to yourself in order to give it to somebody else. It may be your couple, it may be your children, it may be somebody else, a charity, something, whatever. And I think that's an amazing example because it's very hard to find those examples in guys who are. Michael Keaton is probably now 70, and he was freaking Batman in '89. So he was a great example. And now that his kids, I think it's just one son, and now that he's an adult and full functional adult, he just wants to go back to his movie business, and he's starring
Yeah.
in Beetlejuice Part Two and stuff like that.
Yeah. And he's a good example that obviously he's tremendously talented, and he's kind of had a great run since he came back for Birdman. I think that was that when he kind of came back and suddenly we're like, Jesus, this guy's a really good actor. Probably realized, okay, I feel like now I can slowly stop stepping back, and I've given my son enough autonomy and the right foundations for him to not need me as much. And now I can go back to like, I think there's an interesting aspect of altruism there that I think is interesting. The other thing it makes me think of is, and I sent this to you as well yesterday, from Stephen Yun, the guy who plays Glenn in The Walking Dead, who I was just reading an interview about masculinity, I think, or something. But someone basically saying that one of his mantras is something like kindness breeds safety and safety breeds confidence, something like that. But I really like how by doing that, he's basically acknowledging that his role is to set a scene, is to set an environment, or to help set an environment. I should qualify, like it's if you're two parents or co-living or whatever, you both set an environment, but you're both responsible for it, right? And if you're showing up as a man who goes, my interests come first, I'm the one breadwinner, so don't question my decisions around work, whatever, whatever, what kind of scene are you setting? Because it's just setting a scene where it's like your individualism trumps everyone else's needs. And is that what you want to model to your kids? So yeah, Michael Keaton's a great example. What about in advertising? Is there any like brands or
Well, I
companies that you think represent
well,
masculinity well?
I really struggle with that.
Don't say Gillette. Don't say Gillette.
No, 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 for fuck's sake, no, no, no. I think I mean, the just finish off on the cultural aspect of it. I was looking at kind of the many leadership positions that have kind of embodied this new masculinity in a way. I was thinking about, Barack Obama, George Clooney, Ryan Reynolds, maybe to an extent, but they're still very powerful men married to very smart women who are basically their sidekick, because George Clooney, I think, is still married to amazing lawyer that's been, working her ass off to protect children around the world. Then you have obviously Obama's wife, which is an amazing woman as well. You have Ryan Reynolds' wife, who's an actress as well. But somehow these guys, they are talking about masculinity, and they are still kind of, they are not really power couples. They are standing out, compared to their wives. Whereas I think there is probably their wives are smarter and deserve more to stand out than they do. Anyway, advertising is hard. I think we are very far from the point where it's irrelevant whether it's a man or a woman doing something in an ad, because gender roles are gone, and therefore it's anybody can do anything. I think if we did look at ads here in Spain a few years back, 5, 6 years back, and the roles of women were still very much about care, and grooming the family and taking care of the home, even if they were shown in kind of professional roles as well, but their attitudes were still very much those very, very backwards kind of
Yeah.
classic regional attitudes. Whereas men were aggressively seeking success and getting shit done. Da, da, da. And I mean, we're still in 2024, and you have Arnold Schwarzenegger selling power drills, for fuck's sake. So even if we try and be very progressive as an industry, I think advertising, when you look at agency management roles, and you have lots of studies in the UK, in Spain, in the US, everywhere, and you still see that management roles, CEOs, ECDs, etc., are still male dominated, even if it's gotten better. But I
Yeah.
think just the ads we see, it's a reflection of the culture in agencies, and probably on marketing teams as well, but clearly.
What's your views? It's a contentious topic. I have a view on it, but what's your views on like quotas for representation to kind of start fixing that?
Well, I think there is a point where we probably as a society, we need to overcompensate for the lack of balance between men and women historically, right? Because we're talking about centuries of this kind of momentum where men dominated, and that was that. So I understand quotas as part of this kind of overcompensating tactic, if you wish, to make sure that we end up in a state where real equality happens. I can understand, and I empathize. And my mom, she's a doctor and a professor of medicine, and she was always furious when we discussed women quotas in whatever, maybe in government, in the medicine faculty, or in hospital, whatever maybe, because she says it was kind of demeaning to women, and you're just there, and she hated the fact that somebody would point out you're just there because you're a woman, and we have to be 50-50. I can understand that, but I think it's a necessary step to right a historical wrong, and hopefully we'll get the point where we are not looking at CVs and profiles of candidates based on whether they are men or women, or hiring people because they may or may not get pregnant in the
Yeah,
near future. Still happens, and it's really fucked up.
it happens a lot. Yeah, it really does. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, I didn't have a fully formed view on it until I read The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry. And I think he makes a compelling case for why, yes, it feels quote unquote unfair, but it's necessary because otherwise change is too slow,
Yeah.
for the same reason that, yeah, otherwise it's just going to take forever. And I think, between him and some other studies that I saw on gender representation in UK politics, it's like, no, sorry, gender equal pay, but it was born out of studies from the Women's Equality Party in the UK. It would be like, at the current pace, we're going to have equality in like 2103 or whatever. It's like, do we really want to wait that long for it? Or do we need to like force the system a little bit? So I definitely agree with that as well. Just back on one question that I've been finding interesting on male attributes. Do you think there are, and part of my brain goes to like the the golden mean of like, well, whoever it was, Aristotle, whatever, that said about virtues that become vices. But like, do you think there's positive attributes of men that, when taken too far, become negative?
You made me think with that question. I think I would say that it's interesting because when we define and we talk about modern masculinity, or kind of however we want to call it, the contrary to toxic masculinity, which by the way, I'm not sure if it's positive masculinity, constructive masculinity, healthy, wholesome. I'm not sure what the right word is.
Whole food masculinity.
But I think it's a bit reductionist when we tend to craft masculinity just in contrast or in comparison with women, right? Because we should exist. Human beings are entitled to an existence regardless of the others of context, in a way.
Hmm.
And every time I tend to think about masculinity, I think about women and how men relate to women, which in a way feels to me it's a bit reductionist. Even if, talk about fatherhood, and every time you talk about fatherhood, you end up thinking about your role as a dad, opposed to, or not opposed, but in balance with the role of women as a mom, right? And I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, we are missing out on something interesting if we think about men by themselves, as kind of as a whole, not just compared to women.
I think that's interesting because it feels like an interesting reframe on the whole needing to win. Because Grayson Perry also makes a very good point in his book where he talks about how it's going to be hard. We know psychologically we're all we hate the idea of losing something more than we take pleasure from winning something.
Yeah, that's
So
kind
if
of
you're in a position of power and you're basically going, we need quotas so women are more in power, or people who don't look like you and who are not your skin color, etc. There's a primal fear of like, oh, does that mean that I'm going to have less opportunity? And he basically says, until we let go of that mode of thinking, it's very hard to change because that's still a winning mode of thinking. It's like, if you win, I lose. And it's very oppositional. But what you're talking about is interesting. It's like, what happens if you're not trying to win or lose? You're just trying to find ways that everyone coexists. Now, I don't know how to solve that, but psychologically, it definitely, I
Yeah,
notice I'm healthier to be around if I'm not always thinking I'm keeping score. You know what I mean?
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that words do matter, and I think even if we agree with the idea, I think feminism as a word, it has a negative connotation for many men. Feel threatened by, I think in Spanish we have machismo, which is this male-dominated macho culture, and men tend to oppose feminism with that. So it's okay. This used to be the rule of men, and now they want to be able to the rule of women, where we are subsided, and we are slaves to women. Da, da, da. So, and I think the word doesn't really help in a way. I really like to talk about equality and being balanced and equal, because I think it kind of conveys some kind of a less threatening message to many men out there who are, reacting badly probably to the new world because they feel, threatened, and they don't want to move from a position of power to a position of submission.
Yes, absolutely. You touch on something else is there as well there, which is who is sending that message to men. I was talking to a woman, should call it out. It was a woman who made this point to me that the fact that a lot of what's going wrong with masculinity narratives comes from women makes men feel threatened again. And what happens if it's men talking about this amongst themselves as well, normalizing that, or men and women talking about it more harmoniously? It's one of the reasons I'm also scheduling conversations with women, just like I'm having with you, because I think there's something powerful in the body language of let's get a woman and a man to talk openly about stuff instead of just women talking about men. Or, it's better to have also men talking about men, but a man and a woman talking about men feels to me like it's a more appropriate or a more interesting, more rich kind of conversation.
Yeah, I
Especially
agree.
because you end up catching your own biases here and there as well. But yeah, there's the language bit is interesting. Who the language comes from is interesting as well. On the topic of what men can do, just like going more into practical things, like what obviously we see tons of, even if we're not aware of it, you and I have probably seen tons of things where we thought that's not quite right and we didn't do anything about it, or we could have done more about it. You can always do more about it. But like, what are practical things that you think men can do to deter negative male behavior, whether it's at work, in a daily life situation, heaven forbid, someone being an asshole on LinkedIn? Never heard of that.
I think I think the problem, if you think about it, I think the problem is that most positive males who are not toxic, they are invisible, and we're talking about, husbands who take the kids to football practice. We're talking about 8-year-old kids who stand up for girls who are being bullied at school. We're talking about entrepreneurs who hire and pay men and women equally, and those people tend to be invisible in society because they don't really, pull out their chest and kind of brag about it. So I think if we want to deter negative male behavior, I think we need to be exemplary. And and lead with example, and this applies particularly to kids, which I think kids tend to learn at least as much from what you do as what you say, right? So I think speaking up when toxic masculinity happens anywhere, in the public transport or at work or whatever, I think that's important. And just maybe because the guy being toxic may not even be aware of the fact that he is behaving in a toxic way, and generally speaking, I think when it comes to toxic masculinity, I think empathy is nice, but I think fixing shit behavior is even nicer. So we have to be exemplary and stand up against those,
Also, the fact you're focusing on model the good, don't just highlight the bad. Obviously, highlight the bad, but also find ways to model the good feels like it's
celebrate the good. Yeah.
psychologically more effective, right? You and I know those studies where it's like if you highlight how many people drop cigarette butts in the park, you actually increase the propensity of people dropping cigarette butts in the park because you've normalized the bad behavior. What you should do is say, here's the amount of people that didn't do it, so that that becomes the normalized behavior. Now, obviously, with this massive caveat, I'm not saying we enter the whole not all men kind of bullshit. What I am saying is, and I agree with you, you don't see enough the people bigging up the ones doing it right. We see a lot of people putting down those who are doing it wrong. And obviously, you should do that latter, but I wish I'd see more of the former as well, because I don't know, I think even before you realize it, you start emulating the behaviors you see. I think that happens a lot in companies. Like I was talking, for example, yesterday with one of my strategists in my team, and we were having like a coffee and just catching up. And we were talking about, she was basically asking, oh, how do you feel being one of the only person with kids in the agency? Like, do you feel like there's pressure for you to when you need to leave? And I'm like, honestly, I don't feel any pressure at all. Firstly, because people are nice enough to know that I need to leave at a certain time, but also because my former boss of mine made a point to, it's 5:30, I'm going because I got to pick up the kids. It's no exceptions. And we all learned to adapt to that. And we all basically started modeling that at some point. Not always possible, but in your mind, it's like, okay, it's normal to just say, I got to go because I got shit to do. I got to pick up the kids, whatever, whatever. And even if you don't have kids, I would extend to that. Like, it should be normalized that if you got to go, you got to go.
I think arguably for me as a dad, the number one role model right now is Bandit, Bluey's
Big
dad.
time.
So we should probably be talking about Joe Brown, the creator of Bluey, and how through the writing of one key character, which is shifting the dynamics of the dad relationship.
I love it.
Particularly compared with Peppa Pig, which used to be the leading cartoon worldwide, and the dad was a lazy fucker, and I think just shifting that character, the whole show is completely different, and you're showing a great example of a great dad to both children and parents.
That's true. And you see all the emotional sides of Bandit. There are episodes where he's angry. There are episodes where he's playful. There's an episode which is heartbreaking and actually beautifully written where they go to the beach and Bandit is having like this, he's not feeling quite right. He's like sitting down and just looking at the sea and just being a bit like, it's like he's triggering a bad memory. And then they play for a bit and then he comes back and then he goes into it again. And then he gets distracted. He does something else. And you never know what he was thinking, but you know that there was something deeply sad about that experience that reminded him of something deeply sad. And I love that that's portrayed as like this happens to men and you don't need to be an asshole about it. You don't need to be reactive about it. He's just there feeling sad because of some bad memory he had when he was a kid or maybe whenever. And I love that they never explained it. I love that it was just like, it happens. This is normal. And we still make it work. We're still playful when we're sad. It's like he allowed himself to feel it. He didn't hide it. But then he also was able to kind of adjust to the environment of what their kids needed that day, et cetera, et cetera. So I really like that for that, like that richness of who he is as a character. And I appreciate we're fanboying over basically a cartoon dog, but he's very well written. It's very well written.
Well, I'm sure there will be in a decade from now, 20 years from now, there will be academic papers written on the impact of Bluey and Bandit on modern masculinity and relationships and stuff like that.
I agree. I agree. Right. So last thing, like if you could instantly project one message into men's brains, what would it be?
I would go back to Bill Murdoch and his paper, and adapt his paper from "he might be right" to "she might be right." I think just even if you don't agree, even if you don't really understand what particularly women, but other people are thinking or why they are saying the things they're saying. I think it's interesting to put yourself in a position where you wonder, they may have a point, even if you
Yeah.
don't see it, if you don't really get it. But I think that's a really good starting point. And I would add to that message, I would add a question for men, which is, do you think the other person feels the same way you do about something that
Mm,
just happened? I think just asking yourself that question, which you were referring to earlier in our chat, I think that's really helpful.
mm.
It's not so much about the content, it's about or who's right, it's about how the other person feels about it, and whether
Yeah.
your feelings match, and you're in the same emotional state as the other person.
It's interesting. So that's a great point to finish on. Just one final build on that. It's interesting that certainly we as strategists and in the communications business, we talk a lot about how all human beings share certain universal traits. And one of them is we are feeling creatures that rationalize what they feel. And somehow we don't adapt that idea to when a man is having an exchange with someone else. We go, oh, that's just how you feel. It's not valid. It's like those two things. There's many things that can be true at the same time, but these two cannot be true at the same time. You're either feelings are the reality of people, and then we rationalize them, and therefore the feelings are very valid, or they're not. And you can't just have it both ways, And I definitely fall more on the camp of like, if you felt something, if you perceived something, it's valid. And then, of course, we can unpack it together. We can try and understand where it's coming from, but it's valid. It's not just a feelings thing. And
That,
yeah,
that that's
I
the
think,
thing, and if you never put yourself in a mindset where you accept that the other person might be right,
yeah,
or maybe okay that she feels differently, you will never actually come around.
absolutely. Or improve or understand yourself better. One thing as well on that is a few times when I've spoken with Raquel and I was either a bit stressed about something that happened during my day, whatever, or maybe I was just like more on problem solving mode and I was a bit like stern or whatever. I remember her saying, you don't realize it, but when you speak to me like that, you remind me of when my dad used to get aggressive with us. And I'm like, Jesus, like, I'm so sorry. Like, immediately you go, for me, it's a classic like Street Fighter film thing. For her, it was a traumatic memory. For me, it was just dinner on a Tuesday. And like, but the traumatic memory is much more powerful and like it's real. It's a feeling thing, but it's very real. So we should acknowledge more of that stuff for sure.